I'm incredibly honored to introduce to someone I think is basically a living legend, someone who's served this country for 39 years, General Mike Hayden, who has recently retired after his most recent posting as DERNZA, Director NSA, for the previous 6 years. And that's all I want to say. I want to let the man speak for himself. He'll give us some thoughts on how he thinks the Department of Defense is currently approaching cyber warfare. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to come and be with you here this morning. I've got some notes, and I may occasionally come back to the podium to refer to them, but most of what I have to say is fairly informal. Now, there are lots of ways of coming at this question of what is cyber warfare. I really wish that I could come to you and give you case studies, but those are very classified, and I'm just unable to do that. What I can do, and remain unindicted, would be to talk about how it is we're thinking about cyber war. And I think one of the themes I would want to share with you very early on is we're thinking a lot about it, but not very clearly. And a point I think I'll continue to make throughout the presentation is that we're a bit sloppy with our language. We throw the term cyber war pretty much at anything unpleasant that seems to be happening on the net. And we may get there, and we may decide that this domain is of such character that that's a comfortable categorization, but it sure isn't the categorization we have in physical space. So, if you will, let me talk a little bit about American military doctrine, how American military doctrine is thinking about cyberspace, go a bit into cyber command and how that reflects current thinking, and then I will end up with what really are a whole series of issues and questions that are fundamentally unresolved, and then I promise that I'll leave some time for questions. So let's start with the kind of the doctrinal question. How does the American Armed Forces think about this cyber thing? I got first introduced to this in 1996. At that time, I assumed command of the Air Intelligence Agency, which many of you may know. It's now going by the Air Force ISR agency, but it's on Security Hill down in San Antonio, between Kelly and Lackland Air Force bases. I had just come from the Balkans, where I was a chief of intelligence for U.S. forces in Europe. And when you're an intel guy, you need to know your space. Right? You really need to almost have a tactile sense as to where you are. I mean, otherwise, how can you give those kinds of judgments that a commander needs to make operational decisions? So I had come from a war in the Balkans in which it was all about history. Okay? I mean, current ops were important, but what was behind the current ops was decades, if not centuries, of history that would be invisible to an American if he didn't take the extra step to understand it. So that, for example, I can recall there was fighting south of Sarajevo in a city called Mostar. Mostar is along a river called the Neretva. There was fighting. We were briefing Chuck Boyd, who was the 4-star deputy commander of European Command. We were talking about the Croats attacking the Muslims. And he said, Mike, the Croats are on the offensive. Yes, sir. The Croats are on the offensive against the Muslims. How far will they go? General, I think they're going to fight all the way to the Neretva, right to the river, and then they'll hold. And General Boyd says, so why, is that a good defensible line? I said, oh, yes, sir. The banks of that river drop down there about 20 meters, right there in the center of town. It's a wonderful defensive line, but that's not why they will go to the Neretva and stop. And he says, all right, so why? And the answer was because in the great schism of Christendom in 1056, the dividing line between Orthodoxy and Catholicism was the Neretva River. The Croats are Catholic. They think that's their land up to the river. That's as far as they'll go. So, know your context. My context in the Balkans was history, and now I get parachuted into San Antonio to the Air Intelligence Agency, and the context there is this new thing called cyber. We were all going to school on it. We were all trying to figure out what it meant. How do you think about it? How do you organize what's the template? within which you can place your thoughts. And this is fairly old thinking now, but it wasn't old thinking in 1996. And frankly, a lot of the energy for it was coming out of San Antonio, where we were. And it was simply this: cyber is a domain. Okay? It's not a network. It's not a line item in your budget. It's not a program. It's not just bandwidth. It's a domain. And when a GI says domain, what he's really saying is, it's like land, sea, air, space, and now cyber. We actually found that when we began to think of cyber as a domain, it was liberating in terms of our operational and strategic thinking, because once you identify it as a domain, you can gather up the attributes of that domain, which are: it's inherently global, it's inherently strategic, it's characterized by great speed, it's characterized by great maneuverability. I mean, these are all things that shape military thinking. So we found that to be actually a very comfortable model. We just thought of it as a domain, and given our line of work, on a good day, a domain of operations, and on a bad day, a domain of combat. And that was the framework. That's pretty much become American military doctrine now. By the way, you don't get Cybercom, the new 4-star command up at Fort Meade that's supposed to do this stuff in the cyber domain. You don't get Cybercom in American military thought until you embrace the fact that cyber is a domain. Okay? We organize, for the most part, our combat forces on the domains in which they operate. That's why we have an army for that. We have 2 armies for that one domain. We've got the Marine Corps and the Army. We've got an Air Force for the air domain, the Sea Force, and so on. So you have this domain. I left it. I left San Antonio. I went to Korea. Didn't stay up on current thinking. Came back to doctrinal thinking about warfare in the cyber domain. It was still very strongly felt it was a domain, but there were cracks that were beginning to appear in the kind of the foundation of the concept that cyber was a domain just like the other domains. This probably had been obvious to you your entire lives, but it wasn't obvious to us, and only on discovery do you go, oh, sure, of course that's true. But there's a distinction between cyber and the other 4 domains. God made 4. You made the last one. God did a better job. Because now, if you think back, now I actually have these kinds of conversations with other groups, not nearly as knowledgeable as yours, but bear with me so you get a sense of what it is I tell even less technologically agile audiences. I say, you know how this started, right? And I walk them back in history to ARPANET. It came out of the Advanced Research Projects Agency. When the thrust of this, was to how can we connect our labs, all of whom we know and all of whom we trust. How can we connect them in a way that we can move data between and among them quickly and facilely? I mean, that was the technological and entrepreneurial spark that creates what becomes the internet, but created ARPANET. I would suggest to you that cultural framework, the nodes are known and trusted, the problem is moving data, is the cultural framework of the net today, even though the number of nodes is, as a practical matter, infinite, and almost none of them should be trusted. Again, I'm a Catholic liberal arts major. I had a science course, I think, my freshman year in college. So I have to move all these thoughts into another space in order to think about them. And so I move the whole question of cyber domain and ARPANET and its characteristics into physical space and say something along the lines of, you guys made the cyber world look like the North German plain. And then you bitch and moan because you get invaded. We all get treated like Poland on the web. invaded from the west on even number centuries, invaded from the east on odd number centuries. Here's the point. We made it flat. We gave all advantages to the offense. The inherent geography of this domain, which we created, the inherent geography of this domain, everything plays to the offense. There is almost nothing inherent in the domain that plays to the defense. That really affects how you think about it when you're a GI. Now, in the real world, rivers, hills, mountains become a military officer's friend. They actually create boundaries. And I think over time, folks like you, far more knowledgeable about what this really comprises than I'll ever be, you're going to build rivers and hills into the web. You're going to create, I'm speaking metaphorically now, obviously, you're going to create geography, all right, that is going to help the defense. I mentioned when I finished the tour in San Antonio, I went to Korea. I served 2 tours in Korea. Think with me just for a minute about the geography of Korea. Okay? There are only 3 ways the North can invade the South. Okay? They can come down the East Coast Road, and the gap of land between the water and the mountain there is much smaller than the width of this room. There is no one coming down that road in a major armor invasion. There's another corridor called Kaesong-Munsan, which is actually on the floodplains of the Han and the Imjin rivers, which is actually a pretty good route of advance. And that was, by the way, the route that was used by the North Koreans in 1950. They came down Kaesong-Munsan, Seoul. All right? People say, well, they could use that as an invasion corridor today. No, they can't. No, they can't. Many of you have been to Seoul. It's a wonderful international city, great place to visit. It's exciting. 12 million inhabitants. You all think of it as a great urban center. People who go through life with the kinds of lenses I've had to wear know it may be a great urban center, but what it really is the largest tank trap in the world. You will not get armor through Seoul. Which leaves the third route, which is a valley called Chorwan that starts in the north, comes down in the south, and empties south of the urban sprawl that comprises Seoul. It's an ideal for an invasion. Except the valley is very wide in the north, and the further south you come, it gets narrow. And so our view and our O plan there, which is called 5027, the defense of the Republic of Korea, was we get the A-10s to the Korean Peninsula, they die in their tanks at the bottom end of the Chorwan, and we win. There are no Chorwans on the internet we have created. All advantages go to the offense. There's one other thing, too. I said how this 5th domain differs from the other 4. I'm clever enough to either remember an historical example or imagine an example in which you can confine combat in any of those domains, any of those 4, to that domain. Okay? Battle of Gettysburg, that pretty much was a ground thing, right? Not many other domains involved. Battle of the Coral Sea, pretty much a sea thing. Battle of Britain, pretty much air. Haven't done things in space, but you can imagine those circumstances. In cyber, and actually, this was something and I can't get in details of the actual events, this is something that was learned over the last several years in terms of cyber ops. You can never do anything in this domain without something